Feel the neon pulse of a world where every flickering light represents a choice, a chance, or a secret. We capture the high-stakes drama of the streets through a cinematic lens of glowing colors and deep shadows. Subscribe today and keep your finger on the pulse of the night.
I didn't plan what I was going to say. That's the part nobody believes when I tell them this story. They always assume I walked into my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner with some kind of script. Some perfectly rehearsed speech designed to take everyone down a peg. But the truth is, I spent the entire drive there telling myself to keep my mouth shut, smile when smiled at, eat whatever was put in front of me, and leave as soon as it was socially acceptable. That was the plan. My name is Eloise. I'm 32 years old. I run a small but profitable environmental consulting firm out of Portland, Oregon. I have a rescue dog named Biscuit, a one-bedroom apartment with a view of the river that I am deeply proud of, and a family that, for most of my adult life, treated me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I need to tell you about the rehearsal dinner first, but to do that, I need to go back further, to the beginning of things, to the version of me that used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while my sister got driven to dance, recitals, and violin lessons, and birthday parties that she somehow had time for, even though we were apparently at the exact same school with the exact same number of hours in the day. Her name is Adrielle, 3 years older than me. My parents named her after our grandmother on my mother's side, which you could argue is a perfectly normal thing to do. But the way my mother said that name, even in ordinary conversation, even when she was just calling her down for dinner, there was always something in it. A softness, like the name itself meant something sacred that the rest of us couldn't quite touch. I was named after nobody. My parents just liked the name Eloise. My mother told me that once when I was around 9, and I don't know why that detail has never quite left me. Growing up, I was what people charitably call the quiet one. Less charitably, I was invisible, not in a dramatic sobbing into my pillow kind of way. It was subtler than that. It was the kind of invisible that creeps up on you so slowly that by the time you notice it, you've already arranged your whole life around it without realizing. Adrielle was the beautiful one. She really was. I want to be fair about that. Tall, with our mother's dark hair and our father's cheekbones. She was the kind of girl who walked into a room and people rearranged themselves around her. Not because she asked them to. They just did. I was shorter, quieter, more interested in the creek behind our house than in the social architecture of middle school. I collected rocks. I could identify 17 species of native Oregon ferns by the time I was 12. I read books about soil composition for fun. My 6th grade science teacher, Mr. Paxton, once told my parents at a conference that I was the most genuinely curious student he'd taught in 20 years. My mother's response to this, and I know this because Mr. Paxton mentioned it to me years later, laughing, thinking it was charming, was, "Well, let's hope that translates into something practical." I want to be careful here. My parents were not cruel people. They were not abusive. They fed me, they clothed me, they sent me to school, they showed up to things. But there is a category of harm that doesn't announce itself, a slow erosion of a person's sense that they matter, that they take up space worth taking up, that their small accomplishments deserve to be witnessed. That kind of harm doesn't leave marks that anyone else can see, which is exactly what makes it so hard to name. When Adrielle got into the University of Oregon on a partial scholarship, my parents threw her a party. 20 people, catered food, balloons, the whole thing. My father gave a speech. When I got a full academic scholarship to Oregon State. A scholarship that covered tuition, room, board, and a small living stipend. My mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and then asked if I'd called my grandmother yet to tell her the good news, like it was the kind of news that required delegation. We drove to see Adrielle's dorm room that fall. We did not drive to see mine. I told myself it didn't matter. I was good at telling myself things didn't matter. It's a skill you develop when you grow up the way I did. You build a very efficient internal PR department that is always ready to spin the latest incident into something manageable. She was the older one. She needed more support in new situations. They were just tired from the first move. It wasn't personal. College changed me in the way that college changes people who needed it. I found a biology professor named Dr. Keene who told me I thought like a scientist. I found a study group that turned into a friend group that turned into the closest thing I'd ever had to a chosen family. I found a part-time job doing water quality testing for a local environmental nonprofit, and I found out I was genuinely, functionally good at the thing I loved. I graduated summa cum laude. My parents came to the ceremony. My mother cried. My father shook my hand and said he was proud of me. For approximately 72 hours after that weekend, I allowed myself to believe that things had shifted. Then I called to tell them I'd been offered a position at a firm in Portland. And my mother spent most of the conversation asking whether Adrielle had mentioned that she was thinking about taking a trip to Barcelona that summer. I moved to Portland. I worked hard. I worked the kind of hard that has nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with needing something to be yours. I became good at my job in the way that people become good at things when the work is the one place they feel like themselves. At 28, I started taking on private clients on the side. At 30, I had enough business to go independent. At 31, I registered my firm. My parents found out I had my own company the way they found out most things about my life, sideways, by accident, because my Aunt Felice mentioned it during a phone call. My mother called me that evening, and I could hear in her voice that she was recalibrating something. Your aunt says you're running your own business? The tone was somewhere between a question and an accusation. Yes, I said, for about 8 months now. There was a pause. Then, you should have told us. And I thought, I did tell you. Twice. You changed the subject both times. But I didn't say that. I said, I know. Things have been busy. My Aunt Felice is my father's younger sister. She lives in Seattle. She is one of those people who takes up space in a room in all the right ways, loud when it calls for it, quiet when it doesn't, always watching, always noticing. She started noticing me around the time I was 12, at a family reunion where I'd apparently given a detailed and unprompted explanation of the watershed ecosystem to my confused second cousin, and she had found this delightful rather than embarrassing. She was the one who sent me a card when I graduated. She was the one who called on my birthday. She was the one who asked, every single time, how's the work going? Tell me something you're proud of. I don't think she understood fully what those calls meant to me. I don't think she knew she was sometimes the only person in my extended family who was talking to me like I was a full human being with a life worth being curious about. I never told her. I'm telling her now, I suppose, by telling this story. Adrielle met her fiancé, I'll call him by his first name, Trent, at a wine festival 2 years ago. He's a mortgage broker. He's perfectly nice. He has a very firm handshake and strong opinions about barbecue rubs. I have nothing against him. We just don't have a lot to say to each other, which I think is mutual and entirely comfortable for both of us. They got engaged 11 months ago. My mother called me before she called anyone else, first time in recent memory, because she wanted to know if I would be a bridesmaid. I said I would. I don't know why I said yes so quickly. Maybe because it was the first time in years she'd asked me for something that acknowledged I was part of the family. Maybe I wanted to believe that a wedding was one of those events that forced people to see each other clearly. Maybe I was just tired of saying no and calling it self-preservation. I should have trusted my first instinct, which was to pretend I had a work trip. The months between the engagement and the wedding were a particular kind of exhausting. I was included in enough to have to show up. I was left out of enough to be constantly reminded of my position. I found out the bridesmaids were doing a dress fitting. In Portland, my city, from a group text I was added to as an apparent afterthought, sent the night before. I found out the bachelorette venue, the florist, and the color scheme from my Aunt Felice, who was getting the information from my mother, who apparently had not thought to loop me in directly. I want to make something clear. None of this was dramatic. None of it was a screaming fight or a slammed door. It was all just the accumulation of 1,000 small signals that said quietly and consistently, "You are adjacent to this family, not central to it. You are an extra. You will be costumed and positioned and thanked, and then the camera will pan to someone else." The rehearsal dinner was a Friday night in June, at a private room in a restaurant in Eugene. My parents' territory, my sister's terrain. The space was beautiful, pale wood paneling, soft lighting, a long table set for 22 people. Adrielle looked the way Adrielle always looks, radiant, the gravitational center of every eye in the room. I had driven down from Portland that afternoon, 3.5 hours. I had a full day of client calls before I left, and I was tired in the specific way of someone who has been performing competence all day and needs to sit quietly for a while. I walked in, hugged my mother, shook Trent's foster hand, found my seat. My seat was at the far end of the table, between Trent's college roommate, a man named Dougie, who wanted to tell me about cryptocurrencies for 20 minutes, and an elderly great-aunt of Trent's who was lovely but hard of hearing, and required me to repeat everything I said at a volume that made other conversations stop and look. "This is fine," I told myself. "This is fine. Eat the food. Be pleasant. Go back to your hotel." The dinner itself was lovely. 3 courses, good wine. The speeches started during dessert. Trent's father went first, warm and funny. My mother went second. My mother is a good public speaker when she wants to be. She has a warmth that she can turn on in social situations that I have always admired, even as I've understood it was not distributed evenly in private. She talked about Adrielle's childhood, her grace, her determination, her big heart. She talked about the first time she met Trent, how she knew. She talked about what it meant to watch your daughter find her person. And then she said, "For anyone who doesn't know our whole family, Trent's getting 2 sisters-in-law tonight." I looked up. "Adrielle, of course," my mother said, gesturing to the head of the table with a smile. "Our brilliant, beautiful girl." Then she turned in my direction, not quite at me, somewhere in my vicinity. "And Eloise, who... well, she lives up in Portland. She's very busy up there." She said it with a smile. Light, breathy, almost like a punchline she'd already decided was funny. A few people chuckled softly. I saw Trent's mother give a small, uncertain smile. My Aunt Felice, who was seated across and 2 seats down, had gone very still. "She's very busy up there." 22 people at that table. My sister's rehearsal dinner. And that was my introduction. That was the sentence that was meant to hold me. I picked up my water glass. I set it down. I counted to 4, the way I've learned to do when my body starts running ahead of my brain. I thought, I could let this go. This is exactly the kind of thing I have been letting go my entire life. I am a professional at letting this go. I have a PhD in letting this go. And then I thought, I am 32 years old. I drove 3.5 hours for this dinner. I had 7 client calls today. I run a company. I have been quietly letting this go for 20 years and I am tired. I did not plan what I said next. I want to be clear about that. I stood up, not dramatically. I just stood up the way you stand up when you're about to say something, and the sound of my chair pulling back made a few people glance over. "I'm sorry," I said, and my voice was steady, which surprised me. "I just want to add something to that introduction, if that's all right." My mother's smile stayed on her face, but it had gone very still. "My name is Eloise," I said. "I'm Adrielle's younger sister. And I am busy up in Portland. That part's true." I paused just a second. I own an environmental consulting firm. We work with municipal governments and private developers on land use, water rights aids, and ecological impact assessment. Last year, we were brought on by the state as a contracted advisor on a restoration project for the Willamette Valley. We currently have 4 full-time employees and 3 long-term contracts, and last quarter was our most profitable yet. The table was very quiet. I wasn't being combative. I wasn't raising my voice. I was just saying true things in the same tone I would use in a client meeting. Calm, precise. The voice of someone who has walked into rooms and made them take her seriously, even when she started from nothing. I say that not to brag, I continued, but because I realized I've spent a lot of years being Adrielle's sister who lives up in Portland. And I'm really proud of what I've built, and tonight felt like a good night to just say that out loud. In front of people. I looked at my sister. She was watching me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were bright. Adrielle, I said. You're a beautiful bride and Trent is lucky. I'm glad to be here. I meant it. Whatever complicated thing existed between us, that part I meant. I sat back down. The silence held for maybe 3 seconds. Then Trent's father started clapping, and it spread around the table in that slightly delayed way that collective responses do when people are still catching up to what just happened. Picked up my fork and took a bite of my dessert, which was a very good chocolate and torte, and I did not look at my mother for the next 4 minutes. My Aunt Felice caught my eye from across the table. She wasn't clapping. She was just looking at me, and the look on her face was the one I'd been waiting my whole life for someone in my family to give me. Not congratulations, not surprise, just recognition. Just, yes, there you are. After dinner, while people were milling about and ordering the last of the wine, my mother found me near the coat rack. I knew she would. She's not the kind of person who lets things sit. That was a bit much, she said, quietly. Not unkind, exactly, just the way she says things that she's already decided are true. I looked at her for a moment. Was it? You made it about yourself. At your sister's rehearsal dinner, you introduced me to 22 people as someone who is busy up in Portland. I said, that's an introduction you'd give a neighbor. I'm your daughter. She opened her mouth, closed it. I'm not angry, I said, and I was surprised to find that was true. I'm really not. I just needed to say it. I hugged her. I meant that too. She is my mother, and it is a complicated thing to love someone and also need them to see you differently, and I have stopped expecting those 2 things to resolve neatly. The wedding was beautiful. Adrielle was stunning. I stood at the altar in my dusty rose bridesmaid dress, and I watched her marry a man with a firm handshake who looks at her like she's the answer to something, and I cried a little, genuinely, because whatever else is true, she is my sister. At the reception, something shifted. It was small. It's always small with families, I've found. The real changes happen in increments so slight that you almost miss them. Trent's mother pulled me aside early in the evening. She's a retired county judge, which I didn't know until that moment. She asked about my firm with the specific, genuine curiosity of someone who is actually listening to the answers. She told me about a colleague who sits on the board of an environmental foundation in the Willamette Valley. She gave me her card. Later, my father sat down next to me at my table during the band's break. He set his drink down and he looked out at the dance floor for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, I didn't know you had 4 employees. I do, I said. Another pause. That's good, Eloise. That's really good. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a full reckoning with 20 years of being seen sideways. But it was my father at 70 sitting down next to me specifically to say, I see this. And that mattered more than I was prepared for. I kept my face even. I said thank you. I put my hand on his briefly, and then I took it back. My Aunt Felice danced with me twice. She is a very bad dancer, and completely unbothered by this fact, which I have always found one of her best qualities. During the second song, she leaned in close and said, That speech at dinner, I want you to know I've been waiting years for that. I laughed. It surprised me how easy it was to laugh. I didn't plan it, I said. I know, she said. That's why it was perfect. I drove back to Portland the Sunday after the wedding. The highway was quiet that early, and I had the mountains on one side and a very good podcast on the other, and Biscuit was asleep in the back seat with his chin on his paws, and I felt, for most of the drive, something I didn't quite have a word for. Not happy, exactly. Not healed. I'm not naive enough to think one moment at a rehearsal dinner closes out 20 years of being seen as a footnote. My mother is still my mother. My family is still my family. These things don't resolve like stories are supposed to resolve. But somewhere around the Wilsonville exit, I realized what I was feeling. Light. Like I'd been carrying something for so long that I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my body. And for the first time, I'd set it down in a room full of people on a Friday night in June, without anger and without apology, and just let it be seen. I thought about the version of me who used to sit in the backseat of my parents' car on the way home from things, running the post-event analysis in my head. Did I say too little? Did I make it awkward? Did I give them a reason to think less of me? How do I be smaller next time so the room stays comfortable? I thought about the version of me who stopped telling my parents about milestones because the silence on the other end was worse than not sharing at all. I thought about the version of me who drove 3.5 hours to a rehearsal dinner last Friday and told herself the whole way there, just be small, just be quiet, just eat the dessert and go back to your hotel. And then I thought about the version of me who stood up. I am that version now. I have decided to be. I called my Aunt Felice from the car somewhere around Salem. She picked up on the second ring. I'm on my way home, I said. Good drive? Yeah, I watched the mountains. Felice, thank you for the last 20 years, for asking about the work, for noticing. There was a beat of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. You were always worth noticing, she said. Some of us were just paying better attention. I drove the rest of the way home with the windows down. When I got back to Portland, I took Biscuit to the river. It was early enough that the path was mostly empty, and the water was doing the thing it does on clear June mornings, that particular silver green that I've spent most of my adult life trying to protect. And I stood there for a while just breathing. I don't need my family to rewrite the past. I stopped needing that somewhere around 27, I think, though it took me a few more years to know it. What I know now is simpler. I built something real. I built it quietly, without applause, without anyone driving to see my dorm room or throwing me a party. I built it with soil samples and late nights and clients who trusted me and employees who showed up, and a dog who doesn't care what my quarterly revenue was as long as I come home. And on a Friday night in June, in a private dining room with 22 people and a very good chocolate torte, I said my own name out loud. I listed my own accomplishments in my own voice without waiting for someone else's permission. Nobody gave me a standing ovation. My mother still thinks I made it about myself. Maybe I did. But I've been making myself invisible for 32 years, and it turns out that I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to be the quiet footnote in someone else's story. I have my own story. It's a good one. And now you know how it starts.